To the bailiff. Gosh, you don't have to shout. Laughter. Good morning. Call your next witness.
Yes, Your Honor. The next defense witness is Joy Robson.
Please raise your right hand. Face the clerk right here.
I do.
Please be seated. State and spell your name for the record.
I'm Joy Robson. It's Joy Robson.
Thank you.
Good morning, Miss Robson.
Good morning.
Miss Robson, where is your home?
In Sherman Oaks, California.
And do you know the fellow seated at counsel table to my right?
Yes, I do.
Who is he?
That's Michael Jackson.
How long have you known him?
18 years.
And how did you meet Mr. Jackson?
Originally, in Australia.
I think you need to speak up a little bit.
Sorry. In Australia. He was touring on the Bad Tour, and my son Wade was 5 years old and won a Michael Jackson look-alike, dance-alike competition.
Did you develop a friendship with Michael Jackson?
Not immediately. 2 years later, we returned to the United States for Wade was dancing here, and we reassociated with him at that point, and became friends from there, from 1989.
Are you still Michael Jackson's friend?
Absolutely.
Have you been to Neverland?
Many times.
How many times do you think you visited Neverland?
I have no idea. We average about 4 times a year since we've lived in the United States, which is 14 years now, and quite a few times before that.
Do you remember the first time you visited Neverland?
Yes. It was in January of 1990.
And how did you end up visiting Neverland?
When we were here, we called around, trying to find Michael again. He had told us if we returned to the United States to contact him. So we called around, and we eventually were put onto his personal assistant, which at that time was Norma Stakos, and they called Michael. He remembered us, and said he would like to see us again. So we met him at a recording studio where he was working at the time.
And did you stay at Neverland on that first visit?
Yes, he invited us to stay that weekend, so we did. We were touring the United States, we were here on vacation as well. We went away for the week, and came back for the second weekend.
Have you seen Michael Jackson's bedroom at Neverland?
Yes.
When did you first see Michael Jackson's bedroom at Neverland?
That first weekend when we stayed with him.
Ever stayed in that room yourself?
No.
Do you recall your son staying in Michael Jackson's room at Neverland?
Yes.
And explain that, if you would.
Well, the first night they had been out doing the usual thing at Neverland, playing. And later that night, they all came back to the suite where my husband and I were staying, and my parents were with us, as well. We were all talking in the suite. And Wade had been impersonating Michael for some time and had lots of costumes of Michael's that we had made. And Michael was looking at them, and we were just all discussing those. And then it was getting late, and my children said to me, both Chantal and Wade, my daughter, said, "Can we stay with Michael?" And my husband and I sort of looked at Michael, and said, "Well, if that's okay with you." And he said, "Oh, absolutely. If they'd like to stay, that's fine."
And did you allow your son and daughter to stay in his room?
Yes.
How many times do you think your son and daughter stayed in his room?
Many times. I have no idea.
Did you ever have a problem with them doing that?
Not at all.
Have you ever traveled with Mr. Jackson?
Only once. We went to Las Vegas with him.
What was the purpose of that trip?
We went to see Siegfried and Roy.
How did you get to Las Vegas for that trip?
We went on a private jet. I think it belonged to Steve Wynn. We were staying at the Mirage.
And did you stay at the Mirage Hotel?
Yes.
And where did you stay?
We had a penthouse suite. There were 2 bedrooms, and I stayed in one of them.
And who stayed in the other room?
Michael and Wade sort of went between both rooms. He did stay in Michael's room most of the time.
And were you ever in Michael's room on that trip?
Yes. As a matter of fact, we spent a whole day sitting in bed, the 3 of us, eating popcorn, watching cartoons.
Ever see anything inappropriate happen on that trip?
Never.
Ever see anything inappropriate happen at Neverland?
Never.
Okay. When's the last time you spoke to Michael Jackson?
2 weeks ago. We visited his children at Neverland.
Okay. And do you consider yourselves friends of the family of Mr. Jackson?
We consider us very good friends, if not family.
Okay. Did Mr. Jackson ever use the word family to describe you and your children?
Yes.
Okay. Did you ever have any problem with that?
Never.
Ever seen Mr. Jackson hug your children?
Mr. Jackson hugs everyone.
Ever seen Mr. Jackson kiss your children on the cheek?
Yes.
Did you ever have a problem with that?
No.
Ever see Mr. Jackson hold any of your children by the hand?
I think so, yes.
Did you ever have a problem with that?
No.
Ever seen Mr. Jackson playing with your children?
Yes.
And what did you see him do?
He'd play. I've seen him play games, hide and seek. I've seen them climb trees. I've seen them play in the water fort at the ranch. They play constantly.
Did you ever have any problem with any of that?
No. We all did it together often. We all played together.
How would you describe Neverland?
I would have once said the happiest place on earth. I always felt that when we arrived at Neverland, you forgot all your problems, you forgot everything. It seemed like a world on its own. You would drive in there, and it was very serene, very peaceful, very beautiful. Inspirational. And everything was perfect when you drive out and reality would hit again.
What did you like to do there?
Object as immaterial, Your Honor.
Sustained.
What did you do at Neverland?
Object as immaterial.
They put an issue what Neverland's all about, Your Honor.
The objection is overruled.
What did you do at Neverland?
We watched movies. I particularly liked the chimpanzees. I spent a lot of time playing with the chimps. All the animals, I enjoyed. We would play on the water fort. We'd drive the quads around the hills. Just a fun time always.
And did you ever meet someone named Blanca Francia?
When you say, meet her, I mean, I knew she was working there, and I basically would say, good morning, to her if I saw her, but that would be the extent of it.
Ever see your son in a shower with Michael Jackson?
No. Never.
Ever seen the jacuzzi at Neverland?
Yes.
Ever been in it yourself?
Yes.
How many times, do you think?
Oh, maybe 6 or 8 times.
Now, to your knowledge, has your daughter ever been in Michael Jackson's room at Neverland?
Yes.
And did she ever stay over there, to your knowledge?
Yes.
Did you have any problem with that?
Not at all.
No further questions.
Cross-examine?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Before you testified here today, did you review any documents?
I did review my testimony from the grand jury last time, and the civil suit.
Mr. Feldman's grand jury.
Yes.
Deposition?
Yes.
Okay, good. I just want to go back and see if we can discuss some of the things you testified about this morning. As I recall, you first met the defendant at a dance contest in Australia, correct?
Correct.
And that was in what year?
That was in 1987.
And then your first trip to America was, or maybe not the first trip, but in 1990, in January, you came here with the dance troupe, correct?
Yes.
And the time that you met Mr. Jackson in Australia was in connection with your son winning a dance contest?
Yes.
And the occasion of you meeting Mr. Jackson was you were brought behind the stage with a lot of other people who were back there, is that right?
It was a meet and greet situation, yes.
There wasn't a lot of substance to it?
No, it was just, how are you? It's a pleasure to meet you, type of thing.
Okay. And then the next time that you meet Mr. Jackson is when you come to the United States in January of 1990, correct?
Yes.
And when you came here, there were no arrangements when you first came here to meet with Mr. Jackson.
No.
And it was as a result of you making contact with Norma Stackos that you were able to make contact with Mr. Jackson, correct?
Yes.
And then you were invited up to the ranch, as I understand it, for a weekend?
Correct.
So you weren't there for an entire week?
No.
Just for the weekend?
Yes.
And when you went there for the weekend, the first night, your son and daughter spent the night in Mr. Jackson's bedroom, correct?
Yes.
Now, as I understand it, Then, this was only the second time that you had met Mr. Jackson. Is that correct?
Yes.
And the first time you'd really met him on a one-on-one personal basis, correct?
Yes.
And how old was your son at this time?
When we were at Neverland.
Yes, ma'am.
He was 7.
7. How old was your daughter?
10.
So your son and your daughter spent the first night with Mr. Jackson, and this was really the first night you'd ever met Mr. Jackson, that's correct, on a substantive level?
Well, basically we'd spent the day with him, yes.
That was the first time?
Yes.
Now, did you know that your son and daughter spent the night with Mr. Jackson in his bed?
They did not.
They did not.
They slept on the mezzanine level.
That's your belief?
That's what they had told me.
So that, if your son testified here in trial yesterday that he slept in the same bed with Michael Jackson with his sister, that would be inconsistent with what he told you before?
That was the second night.
I'm asking you the first night.
Well, that's what I've been told by my daughter and my son was the first night they slept on the mezzanine level.
So it would be correct that if your son testified to that yesterday, that on the first night he and his sister slept with Mr. Jackson in Mr. Jackson's bed, that statement would be inconsistent with what they had told you before.
Objection. Improper question, referring to the testimony.
All sustain the objection.
The second night your daughter did not stay with Mr. Jackson?
She did.
The second night also?
Yes.
Both nights?
Yes.
Do you recall telling Mr. Feldman during the deposition that on the second night your daughter did not stay with the defendant?
Yes, as a matter of fact, when I read that testimony, and my daughter has told me since that my memory was incorrect, that she did stay.
So you're basing your testimony here today on something your daughter told you as opposed to what you recall when you were under oath in a deposition?
Yes.
Now, is it your testimony that your husband was present during the first visit?
Yes.
Did you go back for a second weekend?
Yes.
And was there a weekend between, or more than one week in between?
There was a week in between.
So it was the following weekend you went back?
Yes.
And when you went back on that occasion, who was present from your family?
My husband, my daughter, my son, and my parents.
Now, on the occasion of the first visit, were your husband and your parents with you?
Yes.
Do you recall testifying at a deposition that your parents and your husband were in San Francisco on a trip the first time you visited the ranch?
No, we were all there for the weekend. They left, we all left and went to they went to San Francisco the second week. We went back to Los Angeles with Michael.
The question was, do you recall testifying to that?
I wouldn't have testified to that.
Okay. Now, during that first visit, the first weekend that you were at the ranch, did the subject of your son going on a trip to Japan come up?
Yes.
So this would have been on the first day or the second day?
I don't recall, I'm sorry.
One of those 2 days, in any case?
Possibly.
And the subject of the conversation was that you had agreed to allow your son to accompany Mr. Jackson on a trip to Japan if they wanted to go, correct?
I think we talked about it.
Well, did you agree to allow him to go with Mr. Jackson on a trip to Japan?
I can't remember really. I think I may have, but we decided not to.
Mr. Jackson decided he would rather spend time with your son than go to Japan?
I think the decision was Wade preferred to stay here. Stay at Neverland.
So it wasn't Mr. Jackson's decision. It was Wade's decision?
It was Wade's decision.
Do you recall testifying in the deposition with Mr. Feldman that was Mr. Jackson's decision to decide not to go to Japan, because he wanted to stay and have the time with your son?
I think what happened was that Wade was given the choice.
Move to strike, Your Honor.
Stricken.
I don't remember testifying to that.
During the first weekend trip to Neverland, did you go to Toys R Us?
No.
Was that the second weekend?
I never went to Toys R Us.
Did your children go to Toys R Us?
Yes.
Which one of those weekends did they go?
I don't recall.
But you do recall a trip?
Yes.
And they went with Mr. Jackson? And they were allowed to buy anything, or allowed to get anything they wanted and Mr. Jackson paid for it, correct?
I think so.
So as I understand it, then, it's your testimony that if Mr. Jackson had wanted to go to Japan with your son, on this first time that you'd met him, that you would have allowed that?
I doubt that.
You had agreed to that?
I don't think so. I don't think I would have agreed to that.
Do you recall testifying in your deposition that you had agreed to allow him to go to Japan?
No.
You had decided early on in your son's career, or life, actually, that you wanted to get him into the entertainment business, correct?
He decided, not me.
Well, he was 5 years old.
Yes. He made that decision at 5.
At 5. It was all his decision?
Yes.
Okay. And you were going to do everything you could as a good mother to try to support that decision, correct?
Yes.
And you felt that your having a good relationship or connection with the defendant in this case could promote that career. Isn't that correct?
You're putting words in my mouth. I've never said that.
I didn't ask you whether you said it or not. I asked you if that's what you were thinking.
No.
You weren't thinking that at all?
Not at all.
You weren't thinking that Mr. Jackson could help propel your son in an entertainment career?
That was not my motive.
I'm not trying to
Yes, you are.
demean your motives. No, I'm not, ma'am. I'm asking a simple question. Did you, in your mind, think that by having a friendship and a connection with Mr. Jackson that could help promote your son's career?
I can't answer that, because I don't think that you're trying to make me say that was my basis for our friendship, and that's not true.
Move to strike as non-responsive.
Stricken.
I asked you a question about whose decision it was to cancel the trip to Japan. And I asked you if it was, in fact, Mr. Jackson. That you had stated previously in your testimony it was Mr. Jackson, and you said you had no recollection of that, correct?
Yes.
And did you have a chance to review your deposition for Mr. Feldman prior to coming to court here today?
I don't remember reading that.
Would it help you to refresh your recollection if I showed you the deposition?
Yes.
With the court's permission, Your Honor.
You may.
Or Mr. Mesereau? Bob?
That's okay.
The procedure is you just read that to yourself quietly, and then I'll ask you a question, okay? And I want to direct your attention to page 181, and from lines 4 to line 9. And you can read anything else you want.
Okay.
Having read that, does that refresh your recollection as to whose idea it was to cancel the trip to Japan?
Well, it says that Wade was given the choice, and Wade preferred to stay at Neverland.
It says, after the first weekend that we were there, he canceled the trip because he wanted to stay and spend some time with us, does it not?
If you read further down.
Yeah, it says, but he asked to go on this trip with your son, and I offered to let Wade go with him.
Further.
Do you want me to read the whole thing?
No, just a few more lines.
It doesn't get any better.
Just a few more lines. It will say exactly what I said.
And then Wade had a choice of going to Japan or staying at Neverland, and he chose to stay.
Yeah, that's what I said. Wade was given the choice. And he decided to stay at Neverland.
But it was the defendant's choice not to go to Japan, as you testified.
He had a business trip and he cancelled it, and because Wade decided to stay at Neverland, but it was Wade's choice.
Thank you. After this trip, you went back to Australia, correct?
Yes.
And before we get to when you come back, which I think is in May of 1990, correct?
Yes.
Okay. I want to ask you a few things about the tour of the house. And when you went to the house at Neverland Ranch, did you go throughout the entire house?
The first trip?
Yes, ma'am.
Actually, yes.
So you were shown the entire house?
Yes.
Including Mr. Jackson's bedroom?
Well, actually, we arrived before Mr. Jackson, my parents and I and Mark Quindoy showed us through the house.
Okay.
I don't think we went into Michael's bedroom initially.
At some point during that tour or during that weekend, did you go into Mr. Jackson's bedroom?
Yes.
When you go into Mr. Jackson's bedroom, you walk down a hallway before you get to the entrance to the door to his bedroom, correct?
Yes.
And as you go down that hallway and you approach the door, a little chime goes off, correct?
Yes.
And the door cannot be opened from the outside, correct? It's locked?
I think so, yes. From memory.
Now, when you went through the rest of the house, did you find any chimes that went off in any of the other rooms in the house?
No.
And it's true, is it not, that none of the other doors in the house had locks on them?
There was no one else staying in any of the other rooms.
No, I asked you whether there were any other rooms in the house where you had to have somebody from inside open the door in order to get into the room?
No.
So you were aware of the fact that at the time that you allowed your children to sleep with Mr. Jackson on the first day or night that you met him, that those children were going to be in a location which you could not get to without somebody from the inside opening the door, correct?
Yes.
Is there something funny about that?
It's not a problem.
I can understand. You weren't concerned about it at all?
Not at all.
Somebody you just met?
I think there's a certain trust that we developed immediately. Nothing ever crossed my mind that there would be a problem there.
In May, when you came back, it was for the purpose of your son participating in an LA Gear commercial?
Yes.
And who arranged for him to be in that commercial?
Michael.
And Mr. Jackson paid his way over here, correct?
LA Gear paid.
And how was yours paid?
LA Gear. He was a minor.
LA Gear paid for that?
Yes, they have to if a minor's working.
Do you recall testifying at your deposition that was paid for by Mr. Jackson?
I testified that LA Gear paid for it. I read that when I reviewed it.
Now, at the time that you came over here for the LA Gear commercial, you were staying in the Holiday Inn?
Yes. In Westwood.
And you were here for approximately 6 weeks?
Yes.
And Mr. Jackson had a condo right across the street?
Yes.
And you testified before, I believe, that during that 6-week period on at least half of the occasions that your son was with Mr. Jackson in Mr. Jackson's bedroom in that condo, correct?
I think so.
And on a couple of those occasions, you actually were in the condo with them and you and your daughter, or you, slept on the floor. Do you recall that?
I think that was the first trip that my daughter and I slept on the floor. It wasn't during that time.
The first trip back in January?
Yes.
Was there a time that you visited Mr. Jackson in his condo in January?
Yes.
Now, these visits to Mr. Jackson when you were staying at the Holiday Inn, many of those calls from Mr. Jackson were very late at night. Isn't that correct?
Yes, he was working.
Move to strike as non-responsive, Your Honor.
All strike the last, after, yes.
And he would call, and on some occasions you would walk your son across the street, correct?
Yes.
And you'd leave him there and go back to the hotel?
Yes.
And there was just he and Mr. Jackson together?
Yes.
And you knew that at that particular point in time, that he was sleeping with Mr. Jackson in Mr. Jackson's bed, correct?
Yes.
When you came over to make the LA Gear commercial, did your husband come with you?
No.
At this point in time, were you and your husband separated?
No.
And your daughter didn't come with you?
No. She was in school.
Okay. Now, during the 6-month period, I want to just concentrate on the period that we're talking about, the May visit. You also visited the ranch on occasion, did you not?
Yes.
And when you visited the ranch on those occasions, you slept in the guest cottage, correct?
No, I slept in the house.
And where in the house?
In the Rose bedroom. In the Rose bedroom.
Okay. And your son slept with Mr. Jackson?
Yes.
Now, do you recall an incident that occurred on Mother's Day during 1990 on a trip to the ranch?
Yes.
And you were upset, correct?
Yes.
And you were crying at one point?
Yes.
And the reason for that was that you had not seen your son all day, correct?
Yes.
And it was Mother's Day?
That's right.
And you found out that the reason that you hadn't seen your son that day was because he had been sleeping all day, correct?
I think so, yeah.
And you spoke to some people at the ranch about your feelings, did you not, one of the employees?
I think someone asked me if I was okay.
And you told them that you felt that your son would rather be with Michael Jackson than with you, correct?
I don't remember saying that.
Do you know somebody by the name of Charlie Michaels?
Yes.
And who is Charlie Michaels?
I think she worked security at the ranch.
And did you tell Charlie Michaels that you felt that the defendant, Michael Jackson, was separating you from your son?
I don't recall saying it.
Do you recall testifying to that in your deposition with Mr. Feldman?
No.
Would it refresh your recollection if I showed you a copy of the deposition?
Yes.
May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes.
Okay.
Does that refresh your recollection?
I don't remember saying it, but I testified to it.
I'm sorry?
I said I don't remember saying it, but obviously I testified back then about it. I don't remember saying it.
You said that Wade would rather be with Michael than with yourself and you were upset about it?
Well, I read it, but I honestly don't remember saying it.
At the time that you were at the ranch on the first occasions that you were there, to your knowledge, did Michael Jackson have a personal maid?
Yes.
And who was that?
I don't remember.
Do you remember meeting anybody by the name of Blanca Francia?
I remember her being there. I think she did clean Michael's room, I think.
Now, during the time that you... Let me just go through this real quickly so we can get up to the time frame involved here. You came back in May of 1990, correct?
Yes.
And you were here for 6 weeks, correct?
Yes.
And then you came back again in February of 1991, correct?
Yes.
For about 7 days?
Yes.
And during the time that you were here in 1991, you spent time on the ranch, correct?
Yes.
You and your son?
Yes.
And then in September 1991, well, let me go back. When you came here in February of 1991 for 7 days, did your husband come with you?
No.
When you visited in September of 1991, you came permanently, correct?
Yes.
You had no intention of going back to Australia?
No.
And you had your son and your daughter with you?
Yes.
And your husband did not come?
No.
And at that point you had been separated from your husband?
Yes.
And then from that point, from September of 1991 up till, let's just say, September 1993, okay. The time frame involved, you and your son spent a great deal of time with Michael Jackson. You were around him a lot, correct?
I don't think so.
You were not at the ranch on a number of occasions during 1991?
My memory is in the entire time we've lived here since 1991, we've only been at the ranch with Michael on 4 occasions in 14 years.
4 occasions?
Every other time we've been here without him.
Would that be the same for your son?
Yes.
So,
He came all the time by himself.
you testified that you've been out at the ranch on an average of about 4 times?
4 times a year, but Michael was never there.
Was that all the way through today?
Yes.
He's never there when you go there.
Very rarely. I can only remember 4 times in 14 years that we've been there with him since we have lived here.
So when you were testifying for Mr. Mesereau and you were talking about ever seeing any inappropriate touching, there were only on 4 occasions that you were even at the ranch to see anything, correct?
Since we've lived here, 1991.
You didn't see anything before that, did you?
No.
Do you recall having a conversation in which you, with June Chandler? Do you know who June Chandler is?
Yes.
June Chandler is whom?
Geordie Chandler's mother.
You've met June Chandler?
Yes.
You've met Jordan Chandler?
Yes.
Jordan Chandler was at Neverland Valley Ranch at the same time as your son, correct?
We were all there together on one weekend.
Okay. And do you recall testifying to a situation in which your son, Wade, was upset because Jordan Chandler was going to spend the night in Michael Jackson's room and Wade had to stay with you in the guest cottage?
I don't remember that. I remember reading it in my testimony, but I don't remember him being upset.
Maybe I'll use a different word. Disappointed?
Possibly.
But you do remember the incident?
No.
You don't?
No.
So when you said you read your transcript, it's in your transcript, right?
I read it in the transcript, but it's 12 years ago. I don't remember it.
I understand. Do you have any reason to believe that you would testify to something under oath in a deposition that wasn't true at the time that you said it?
No, I just don't remember it now.
Okay. Do you recall a conversation in which you told June Chandler that someday Jordan was going to be replaced by another one of Michael Jackson's friends?
Yes.
And you referred to these people as special friends, correct?
According to my transcript, yes.
You don't ever remember using that phrase now?
No.
But you did use it in your transcript back in 1993?
Yes.
And in a conversation you told June Chandler that with these special friends, that when Mr. Jackson moves on to the next special friend, that it has a tremendous emotional impact on the children when they're no longer the favorite, correct?
As does everybody when they lose a friend.
I'm sorry?
As does everyone if you lose a friend or a friend becomes friendly with somebody else.
Did you not, in that conversation, specifically refer to the situation where a young child was a friend of Mr. Jackson's and is replaced by another young child and that has, and you were reflecting upon the emotional problems it creates for that child?
Yes.
Now, during the time that you were at the ranch, you described a situation this morning for the jury. You told them that when you go to Neverland it's like walking through a door and you forget all your worries and all your cares.
Yes.
That's a paraphrase so. Now, it's also true that what happens at Neverland Ranch, is it not? That when children come on the ranch, they sort of lose all of their rules and guidelines for conduct?
Well, that depends on the child.
Okay. With regard to the time you were at the ranch, the children that you saw were your son.
Yes.
Correct? And your daughter, correct?
Yes.
And you saw Jordan Chandler, correct?
Once.
And you saw Macaulay Culkin?
I don't think I've been there with Macaulay Culkin.
Brett Barnes?
I've never been there with Brett.
With regard to the conduct of your son when he was on the ranch, did he get carried away, do things there that he didn't do other places in terms of manners?
No.
He was perfectly.
My son was always respectful, always considered it a privilege to be there.
Did he ever do anything that you would think that would not be a good thing to do?
Not that I'm aware of.
Are you aware that he was throwing pebbles or rocks at the lions with Mr. Jackson?
I think that's been paraphrased. I think what they did is they threw them at the cage, not the lion.
Move to strike as non-responsive, Your Honor.
Overruled. Next question.
So you make a distinction between throwing them at the cage and the lion itself?
Absolutely. They were just trying to make the lion roar. All it did was make a noise.
I see. How about, does your son ride the go-karts there?
Go-karts or the golf carts?
The golf carts.
Yes.
Ever have any problems with getting in any accidents while he was there or driving too fast or being admonished for driving too fast?
He may have been admonished for driving fast. He was never in an accident.
The other children that I've mentioned, did you see them acting out at all at Neverland Ranch?
I heard stories. I've never seen it.
Now, when you testified about Mr. Jackson and his special friends in your deposition, you mentioned that the first of the ones that you knew about was your son Wade in 1990, correct?
Yes.
And then in 1991 was Macaulay Culkin, correct?
Yes.
And in 1992, Brett Barnes, correct?
I think so.
And then in 1993, towards the end, was Jordan Chandler, correct?
Yes.
With regard to Brett Barnes, you went to Chicago with your, or I should ask you this. Did you go to Chicago with your son to shoot a commercial?
A music video, yes.
And did you go there?
Yes.
And with your son?
Yes.
And did you meet Brett Barnes there?
Yes.
And was Brett Barnes with the defendant?
Yes.
And in fact, Brett Barnes was staying with the defendant in the defendant's room, correct?
I don't know.
Did you see whether or not, did you meet any of the Barnes parents there?
His mother and his sister were there on the set.
You sure of that?
Yes.
And was it you became aware of the fact that Mr. Jackson referred to some of these young boys as his cousins, correct?
Yes.
And you were asked why Mr. Jackson referred to them as his cousins, correct?
I was asked?
Didn't you say that Mr. Jackson used the term cousins because he didn't want the kids to get jealous of each other?
Yes.
Now, do you recall an incident that occurred where you were supposed to catch a plane and you couldn't find your son?
Yes.
And the fact is that you hadn't seen or heard from your son for 2 or 3 days.
I think too.
And he had been with Mr. Jackson during that entire time, correct?
Yes.
And I believe what you said was you were upset and you were hurt by this, correct?
I don't remember that.
You called a number of people trying to locate your son, correct?
I was trying to call Michael, and he was in the recording studio, not answering, not receiving phone calls. And I think I called Neverland to see if they had gone to Neverland.
Well, you called Neverland and you got the Quindoy, Mr. Quindoy, correct?
I don't remember.
Do you know who Mr. Quindoy is?
Yes.
And you were very upset and wanted your son to be returned so he could make the flight?
I called to ask if they perhaps were at Neverland. That's all I remember.
You don't remember saying that you needed your son returned, that you were very upset and you were going to miss the plane?
No, I don't.
Did you call Norma Stackos trying to locate your son?
Yes.
So just to recap just a little bit, when you were in Las Vegas, you went there by jet. Do you know whose jet that was?
Steve Wynn.
I'm sorry?
Steve Wynn's jet.
Steve Wynn. And you went to a hotel?
Yes.
Which is the Mirage.
Mirage.
And you stayed in a suite?
Yes.
And except for the night, or the day when you all stayed in bed watching cartoons, eating popcorn, your son slept with Mr. Jackson and you slept in the other room?
It was one night, yes.
And now, when you came to the United States in 1991, in September, you came here on originally you came here on a visa, temporary visa?
A 6-month visitor's visa.
Okay. And your goal was to stay here permanently?
Yes.
And your goal was that you came because Mr. Jackson had indicated to you that he was going to help your son in his career, correct?
I'm not sure about that.
Do you remember testifying in your deposition that the defendant had arranged deals for Wade with his Sony Records, Sony Movies and Sony TV?
No, that came after the fact. After we'd been here. He didn't promise anything when we came. He actually came to work on the black and white video.
Your Honor, move to strike the comments. No question pending.
All object. Your Honor, the prosecutor didn't allow her to complete her answer.
Sustained. The request to strike is denied.
May the witness be allowed to complete her answer, Your Honor?
Yes. Do you want your answer read back as far as you gave it?
No. He came here originally in 1991 to work on the black or white video, and we stayed after that. That was the reason for coming in the first place.
Okay. I want to ask it again, just to be clear. Did Mr. Jackson tell you, before you left Australia, that he would help you in any way he could with his record company, his movie company, and his television company, and these were 3 deals that he had organized with Sony, correct?
There were no deals organized. He did say he would do what he could to help, but there were no deals organized.
Would it refresh your recollection if you looked at your testimony before the grand jury?
There were no deals. If I testified, I don't think I would have testified to that.
Would it refresh your recollection if you looked at it to see whether you testified to that?
Yes. Okay.
Does that refresh your recollection as to what you told the grand jury?
No. I don't remember that.
You don't remember telling them that he'd organized 3 deals for your son?
Well, he didn't, so I don't remember it.
But that's what you said.
I don't know what I meant there. There was nothing organized.
Did you say in the grand jury that you considered these arrangements to be a personal commitment from Mr. Jackson directly to you?
No.
You didn't say that?
I don't remember saying that. There was no commitment.
May I approach, Your Honor? Would it refresh your recollection if I showed you your testimony before the grand jury?
Yes.
Yes, you may approach.
May I approach?
Yes.
It's just 1 line. Or 2 lines. Does that refresh your recollection as to what you told the Santa Barbara County grand jury?
No.
It does not at all?
No.
But you did say that?
Obviously I did. I have no memory of it.
And when you came here in September 1991, Mr. Jackson also helped you with some rent for the first month, correct?
That was part of the video. You're always housed when you come to work on a music video.
I think the question was, did Mr. Jackson pay for your rent the first month you were here?
Yes.
Now, when you came here in September, you also went to work for MJJ Productions, correct?
No.
Let's see if I get this right. You had a job in cosmetics?
Yes.
And because you were here on a certain kind of visa, they couldn't pay you, is that correct?
They did pay me, but they paid me through Michael Jackson's company.
So your checks were from MJJ Productions?
Well, that makes it sound like MJJ Productions was paying me. They were not.
The question was, the checks came from MJJ Productions?
They were diverted through Michael Jackson's company.
In other words, your company would pay them the money, and then Mr. Jackson's company would pay you the money?
Yes.
Just in all fairness. I'm not trying to trick you.
Okay.
And that arrangement was worked out with the approval and the help of Mr. Jackson, correct?
I think so. I didn't speak to him about it. I spoke to Norma Stakos about it.
Do you recall telling and testifying to the fact that what actually happened in September of 1991 is that Mr. Jackson was your sponsor when you came to the United States with your son?
Not initially. We were here for 6 months and then he offered to sponsor after we arrived.
You mentioned to this jury that at some point in time, you realized that your son was spending time in bed with Mr. Jackson, correct? Sleeping in the same bed with Mr. Jackson?
Correct.
Okay. And in fact, you indicated in prior testimony that you realized that and knew that early on in the relationship between your son and Mr. Jackson, correct?
Correct.
Okay. We're almost done. Let's fast forward a little bit to 1993. You were at the ranch in 1993 and Jordan Chandler was there, correct?
Yes.
And in 1993, that was the occasion of you having the conversation with Mrs. Chandler that you've described to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury previously, correct?
Correct.
And during this particular point in time, not January, but in 1993, at some point, your son was in the process of putting together an album deal where he or somebody with him would cut some records, correct?
Correct.
And the negotiations began on that deal when?
From memory, June of 93.
And I think you described that process as about a 6-month process?
Well, it varies. But that one took that long, yes.
And the deal was finally signed on December 6, 1993, correct?
Correct.
And the deal was signed with MJJ Productions, correct?
Correct.
And in the deal, your son, not your son, the total deal was for $100,000, correct?
The production company.
Right. And your son's share of that was $30,000?
Correct.
And $15,000 of that was given as an advance?
I think so.
And this was in December of 1993, correct?
I don't really remember. I think according to the transcripts that's what it said.
And you took, let me go back. There was a period of time. Where were you on Thanksgiving? Do you remember where you went Thanksgiving? Did you go to New York Thanksgiving?
I read the transcript. We were in New York recording.
Okay. With who?
With the production company and they were recording for the album.
Okay. And up until the point of Thanksgiving of 1993, the record deal had not been finalized yet between your son and their representatives and Mr. Jackson's company, correct?
Correct.
And there had been some delay in the signing of the contracts, correct?
Yes.
And one of the things that had happened in between the time that you first started negotiating the contracts in June or July and December 6 when you finally signed the contract with Mr. Jackson's company was that Jordan Chandler had gone to the Department of Social Services in the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office and reported that he'd been molested by Michael Jackson, correct?
Objection. Objection. Assumes facts not in evidence.
I'm asking what she's aware of, Your Honor, and it has to do with motive and bias.
Just a moment.
No foundation.
The objection is overruled. You may answer.
You were aware of that, were you not?
Yes.
And in fact, let me ask you this. You know a person, or knew a person by the name of Anthony Pellicano, did you not?
Yes.
And Mr. Pellicano was Mr. Jackson's private investigator, correct?
Correct.
Objection. Beyond the scope.
Overruled.
And Mr. Pellicano was the one who was holding up the deal, correct?
Correct.
He told you that?
Yes.
And the deal was finally signed on December 6 because the defendant intervened and said, go ahead and sign the deal, correct?
Correct.
In the meantime, Mr. Pelicano had given you a $12,000 loan, correct?
10,000.
10,000, you're right. Absolutely. Pardon me, $10,000 loan?
Correct.
And did you ever repay that?
Yes.
When?
I don't remember.
Do you have any proof?
Probably. I don't remember when it was.
When's the last time you saw Mr. Pelicano?
I haven't seen him since. I have not seen him since 93.
Since 93. So it's your testimony you paid him back in 93?
It was some time after that.
Mr. Pelicano was Mr. Jackson's investigator and you had at least 4 conversations with him, interviews, you and your son, correct?
Probably.
And that was after Mr. Jackson got back in December of 1993?
I don't remember.
You were asked by Mr. Feldman to give a statement to an investigator, and you refused, for his office, and you refused to do that, didn't you?
I don't remember. I'm sorry.
Do you remember the Los Angeles Police Department coming to your apartment?
Yes.
And you didn't give them a statement either, did you?
Yes.
You gave them a very brief one and then said you had to go somewhere. Isn't that what happened?
No, they were trying to interview Wade without me and I told them they were not to do that.
Was there some concern on your part that trained law enforcement officers shouldn't talk to somebody who could possibly be a suspect, sick, of a crime?
I was concerned of manipulation.
That the consequence, law enforcement would manipulate your son?
Absolutely.
You felt that your son could be manipulated easily?
No, but I wasn't going to take that chance. He was 10.
You weren't concerned about the fact that the defendant in this case, Mr. Jackson, might manipulate your son?
No concern at all that he would manipulate my son.
But 2 law enforcement officers, you thought they would?
Possibly. I don't know them. I know Mr. Jackson.
Okay. Now, you received actually a loan from Mr. Jackson for $10,000 in 1992, correct?
Yes.
You never paid that one back?
No.
And did you receive another loan from Mr. Jackson after the record contract was signed?
I don't think so.
Do you recall telling an investigator that you had gotten a loan from Mr. Jackson for $10,000 and you tried to buy a car? Do you remember that?
He paid for the balance of the car.
Mr. Jackson did?
Yes.
That was $10,000?
Yes.
Now, in December of 1993, after the allegations with Jordan Chandler had surfaced, Mr. Jackson came back to the United States, correct?
Yes.
And to your knowledge, on the very first night he was back he called your son, correct?
He called me.
He called you?
I think so. From memory.
Do you remember testifying that you weren't at the house when the call was made, that you were out with some ladies?
I do remember reading that, I'm sorry.
So you weren't there?
Possibly.
You came home, and then both of you, late in the night, drove to Neverland Valley Ranch, correct?
Correct.
When you got to Neverland Valley Ranch, it was about 1:30 in the morning, correct?
Correct.
When you got there, you went to the guest quarters and your son went to Mr. Jackson's bedroom, correct?
I don't remember where I slept, but he did go to Michael's bedroom.
But he went inside the house?
Yes.
Where was your son going to school when school started in September of 1993?
I think he was doing homeschooling by then.
Do you remember him at some point in time going to school with a family named the Kennedys?
No.
He had a close friend?
No.
Do you remember a young boy by the name of Teja, T-E-J-A?
No.
Is the reason that you took your son out of school because the kids at school had found out that he had been sleeping with Michael Jackson and they were making cruel statements about him?
I took Wade out of school after the 4th grade. It was before any of this surfaced.
So he was not in school during the 5th and 6th grades in the valley?
Never been in school in the valley.
Okay. May I have a moment? Excuse me just a second, Your Honor, I'm trying to find a report. Okay, let's just do it this way. Here it is. Kenneth Clark, I'm sorry. Do you know Kenneth Clark?
No.
You don't remember Kenneth Anthony Clark being a good friend of your son's?
Never heard of him.
Did your son ever go to Garden Street School in West Hollywood?
He went there for the 4th grade.
Just the 4th grade?
Yes.
Not the 4th, 5th and 6th grades.
No. He started with Laurel Springs School when he got the record deal.
Yeah, 1993.
He was 5th grade.
So it's your testimony that your son was only there in the 4th grade?
From memory. Maybe part of 5th.
And is your testimony that your son never received? That the home school didn't start at Laurel Springs because of the fact that your son was being teased at school because people found out he was sleeping in bed with Mr. Michael Jackson?
He's never been teased at school. He started homeschooling because he was a recording artist and could not be in school. He was traveling.
I just asked you, is that the case?
That's the absolute case.
Okay. Thank you. No further questions.
Redirect?
Yes, please, Your Honor. Miss Robson, in response to the prosecutor's questions with regard to manipulation, you said, "I know Mr. Jackson." Do you remember saying that?
Absolutely.
Please tell the jury what you meant by that.
Well, I've known Michael for a long time. I know him very well. I've spent many hours talking to him about everything. I feel like he's a member of my family. I know him very well. I trust him. I trust him with my children.
Why?
Because Michael is a very special person. Unless you know him, it's hard to understand. He's not the boy next door. He's Michael Jackson. He's just a very unique personality. He loves children. And he has a very pure love for children. And to know him is to love him and to trust him.
And when did you begin to know Michael Jackson?
I felt like I knew him from the very beginning. He just has that wonderful way of making you feel at home, that I felt like I knew him very early on. But particularly in the 2 years when we were living in Australia before we moved here, and I talked to him every day. We had very long conversations about everything that was going on in his life and my children's lives. And you get to know someone very well when you talk to someone several hours a day over a 2-year period. And then once we moved here, too, we continued that. We've always been able to talk about just about anything.
Now, the prosecutor asked you about Mother's Day at Neverland?
Yes.
Remember that?
Yes, I do.
And you learned that Wade and Mr. Jackson were in a recording studio that day, correct?
Not that day. That was the time that we were staying in Westwood, and Wade and I had our ticket booked to return to Australia. And he had been at the recording studio with Michael for a couple of days, and I just hadn't heard from them. I know that they were working long hours, and then they'd take off again the next day. And I was getting
Move to strike as a narrative, Your Honor. Objection.
Sustained.
Do you remember anything else about that day at the recording studio?
No, just, I had called Norma looking for him, and she found them. She said they were in the recording studio and, Michael is bringing him back to you. They're on their way.
To your knowledge, did your son spend a lot of time with Michael Jackson at recording studios?
Often, yes.
And why was that?
Because Wade was interested in being a recording artist, he was interested in being a producer. He was learning. He loved to be around that and absorb that. He was like a sponge. And that was the relationship that he and Michael had. A lot of it was a working relationship and Michael was teaching him.
Now, the prosecutor asked you questions suggesting that you were allowing your son to be with Michael just to further his career. Is that true?
Absolutely not.
What do you mean?
As I say, he was learning things from Michael. Michael was teaching him everything he knew, and he couldn't, that was part of the friendship, but it was more of a friendship than anything else. And I certainly never asked Michael for anything where my son's career was concerned. I believe in my son, and I moved here for him to further his career. I believed that he could do that.
Objection, Your Honor. Narrative.
Sustained.
Did you allow your son to spend time with Michael Jackson learning the entertainment business?
Absolutely.
Why did you do that?
Because he was learning from the best. Michael offered to teach him everything he could. He believed in him, so why would I not?
Now, your son has had a pretty successful entertainment career so far, right?
He has.
And has he worked exclusively with Michael Jackson or has he done other things on his own?
He's done most of it on his own.
What has he done?
He's become a choreographer. He started.
Object as immaterial, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Well, the prosecutor suggested that you were making decisions about what to do with your children because Michael Jackson could help their careers, correct?
Your Honor, I'm going to object as argumentative and leading.
Sustained.
Did you ever allow Wade to be with Michael Jackson only because Michael Jackson could help his career?
Object as leading.
Overruled. You may answer.
Never. We were friends first.
Why did you allow Wade to spend a lot of time with Michael Jackson?
Object.
Please tell the jury.
Asked and answered.
Overruled.
Please tell that to the jury.
They enjoyed each other. They were very similar people. I remember Michael telling me early on that it was like looking in the mirror, he saw himself all over again. His interest was because he saw Wade's potential. And Wade loved everything that Michael did and wanted to learn as much as he could.
Did you ever lose your trust in Michael Jackson during any point in time that your son was with him?
Never.
Did Mr. Jackson ever do anything that made you suspicious about his behavior towards your son Wade?
Never.
Did Mr. Jackson ever do anything that made you suspicious about his behavior towards your daughter?
Never.
Now, the prosecutor asked you questions about children being jealous if Michael Jackson had another friend who was a child. Do you remember those questions?
Yes.
Please tell the jury what you meant.
It's like any child who has a favorite uncle or someone in the family that everyone wants to be around. And Michael's the sort of person that everybody wants to be around. He has that sort of aura. So naturally, when he was spending time with one child, another child would be jealous. It's the same in any family, if you spend time with one child more than the other.
Your Honor, I'm going to object.
Sustained.
The prosecutor asked you questions about Michael Jackson having special friends who were children. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And what did you mean by that?
Well, there would be people who would spend time with him at particular times more so than others. It didn't mean that he didn't still spend time with all of them. They were all friends of his. But when he spent particularly more time with one than the other, then they were special for the time.
Based upon what you've observed of Mr. Jackson, would it be accurate to say that all over the world children flock to him, don't they?
Absolutely.
Object. Immaterial, leading.
Overruled. The answer is in.
And have you seen children from time to time get jealous because Mr. Jackson is being nice to another child?
Yes.
Has that ever appeared unusual to you?
Not at all.
Did you ever see something that you thought was very suspicious when one child would get jealous of Mr. Jackson's attention to another child?
No, I think that's normal with children.
When you used the term, special friends, what did you mean?
I think just the one that he was spending time with for now. That he considered all of his friends special. I don't know why I would have said that. I don't remember saying special, but I imagine it would have meant just the child that he was spending time with now.
When you used the term, special friends, did you mean to suggest anything criminal was going on?
Absolutely not.
When you used the term, special friends, did you mean to suggest that anything sexual was going on?
Your Honor, that's a leading question. I object.
Sustained.
The word, special, you used that term, right?
Apparently, yes.
Why?
Well, I guess because all children are special and Michael considers them all special. There's nothing necessarily of a bad connotation in that.
I think it's time for the break now.
Oh.
You just took that one breath too long.
Okay.
To the jury, I'm going to take. You're going to get an extra 5 minutes because at the end of our break I want to talk to the attorneys. Just so you know, you'll have a little longer break. It's not a long item. Don't worry.